Some stories are buried, some truths are hidden, and some evidence was never meant to be found. Welcome to Ink and Evidence, where silence tells stories, and every clue brings us closer to the truth. From chilling crime cases to unsolved mysteries and secrets the world tried to forget, we uncover what lies beneath. If you dare to question, if you seek the truth, then you're exactly where you need to be. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe and follow Ink and Evidence. Tell us where you're watching this video from. Your feedback always inspires us. Stay tuned to solve the mystery, because the truth always leaves a trace.
Chapter 1. A Question in the Morning Mist. Was it possible, Miss Marple wondered, for a village to keep a secret so well that even the morning seemed reluctant to speak of it? The mist lay thick over Rosewood village, soft as a whisper and just as concealing. It curled along hedgerows and lingered against the wrought iron gates, muting colors, softening edges, and blurring certainty into suggestion. Even the cobblestones beneath one's feet seemed quieter, as though mindful of something unspoken. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the narrow lane, her gloved hands resting lightly on the handle of her walking stick. She had risen earlier than usual that morning, stirred not by restlessness, but by a faint unease she could not quite name. It was the sort of feeling one learns not to dismiss, an instinct sharpened by years of quiet observation. A blackbird called once from somewhere unseen, its note sharp and solitary in the stillness. Then silence again. There was a curious stillness to Rosewood that morning, not the peaceful hush of contentment, but something more deliberate, as though the village itself were holding its breath. She adjusted her shawl and stepped forward. The lane led toward the heart of the village, though today it felt longer than usual, as if the mist had stretched it, drawing out each step into something measured and slow. Familiar cottages appeared as vague silhouettes before resolving into clearer forms, their windows dim, curtains drawn. No smoke rose from chimneys, though the hour suggested it should. Miss Marple noted this quietly. A door creaked open somewhere to her left. She turned her head slightly, but saw only the suggestion of movement before it vanished again into the fog. Someone was awake then, but not eager to be seen. How very interesting. She continued, her steps unhurried, her gaze attentive without appearing so. Years of practice had taught her the value of seeming to look at nothing in particular. At the bend near the old oak tree, she paused once more. There, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of hurried footsteps, soft, uneven, and quickly retreating. Not the steady rhythm of someone going about their morning, but the anxious pace of someone leaving something behind. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Leaving or fleeing? The question settled into her thoughts like a stone into still water, sending out quiet ripples. She moved on. As she approached the village green, the mist began to thin just enough to reveal the outlines of familiar landmarks. The stone well, the wooden bench, the small post box painted a tired shade of red, all unchanged, and yet something was not as it should be. A bicycle lay abandoned near the edge of the path, its front wheels slowly turning, though there was no wind to move it. Miss Marple stopped beside it. She did not touch it, instead she observed. The chain was slightly off its track. The handlebars turned at an odd angle. One pedal bore a faint smear of mud, fresh, still damp despite the cool air. It had been left in haste. She glanced toward the cottages beyond, their windows still watching, still silent. Curious, she murmured softly. A distant church bell began to toll, its sound low and measured, each note carrying through the thinning mist with a solemn clarity. 1, 2, 3. Miss Marple counted without realizing she was doing so. The bell seemed louder than usual. Or perhaps the village was simply quieter. A figure emerged at the far end of the green, a man moving slowly, his posture stiff. As he drew closer, his face came into view, pale beneath the gray light, his eyes avoiding hers just a fraction too quickly. "Good morning," Miss Marple said gently. "Morning," he replied, though his voice lacked warmth, as if it had been drained of something essential. He did not stop. He did not ask after her health, nor comment on the weather. nor offer any of the small courtesies that usually stitched together village life. Instead, he passed by, his steps measured but tense, his gaze fixed ahead. Miss Marple watched him go. Yes, something had changed. She resumed her walk, though her thoughts had begun to arrange themselves with quiet precision. The abandoned bicycle, the hurried footsteps, the silence behind drawn curtains, and now the absence of ordinary conversation. Individually, each might mean very little. Together, well, she reached the edge of the green and turned toward the narrow path that led past the hedgerows and out toward Rosewood Manor, its distant outline just visible through the lifting mist. There was no particular reason to go that way, and yet she found herself doing so. The air grew cooler as she walked, the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves rising around her. Somewhere nearby, a gate clicked softly, though she saw no one. Again, that sense of being observed without being seen. Miss Marple did not look back. Instead, she allowed her gaze to drift across the hedgerows, noting the small details, the broken twig, the slight indentation in the grass, the faint trace of something dragged or dropped. A handkerchief lay half hidden near the path, its edge caught beneath a stone. She bent slowly, retrieving it with careful fingers. It was fine linen, delicately embroidered with a single initial. She held it for a moment, considering. There were not so many in Rosewood whose names began with that letter, and fewer still who would be careless enough to leave such a thing behind. Miss Marple folded the handkerchief neatly and slipped it into her pocket. The mist had thinned further now, revealing more of the path ahead and the looming presence of the manor beyond. A large house set slightly apart from the village, as though it preferred distance to company. Its windows were dark. Too dark. Miss Marple slowed her steps. The unease that had stirred her that morning had now settled into something firmer, something shaped and defined. Not fear. No, she did not think it was fear. Recognition, perhaps. The quiet recognition that comes when something long understood reveals itself once more. She stopped at the gate. It stood slightly ajar. That too was unusual. Miss Marple rested her hand lightly upon it, feeling the cool metal beneath her glove. For a moment, she simply stood there listening. The village behind her remained silent. The manor before her offered nothing. And yet, something important had already happened. Something the mist had tried, unsuccessfully, to conceal. Miss Marple pushed the gate open with a gentle, deliberate motion. It creaked softly, the sound carrying farther than it should. She stepped through, and as she did, the last of the mist began to lift, as though whatever it had been hiding was now ready to be seen. Chapter 2: The Quiet Secrets of Rosewood Village. By late afternoon, Rosewood Village had settled beneath a hush of falling snow. It came gently at first, a pale dusting over the thatched roofs and garden walls, then thicker, softer, until the world beyond each window seemed to dissolve into white. Smoke rose from chimneys in careful ribbons. Lamps glowed amber behind lace curtains. Somewhere a kettle whistled, then stopped abruptly, as though even the kettle had remembered there was something in Rosewood not to be spoken of. Miss Marple sat beside the fire in the small parlor of the Blue Finch Inn, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. The room was warm, pleasantly so. The logs in the grate gave soft cracks and sighs, and the smell of polished wood, old leather, and cinnamon tea lay comfortably in the air. Outside, the snow pressed itself against the windows, turning the glass silver at the edges. It should have been peaceful. And yet, from the moment Miss Marple had returned from her morning walk, she had felt the village closing around its silence. Not loudly, not obviously. Rosewood was far too polite for that. Its secrets lived in lowered voices, in teacups paused halfway to lips, in curtains that shifted only when one's back was turned. Mrs. Bellamy, the innkeeper, moved quietly between the tables, though there were only 3 guests to serve. Her round face, usually bright with harmless gossip, seemed drawn and careful. When she set Miss Marple's tea beside her, the spoon trembled faintly against the saucer. "Cold evening," Miss Marple said. "Very cold, miss. Snow has a way of making everything seem still." Mrs. Bellamy glanced toward the window. "Yes, still." There was a pause, small but revealing. Miss Marple took up her cup. One hears so much more clearly in stillness, don't you think? The innkeeper's hand tightened around the edge of her tray. For a moment it seemed she might say something. Her eyes moved toward the door, then toward the staircase, then back to Miss Marple. But whatever thought had risen in her was quickly folded away. "Will you be wanting supper at 7?" she asked. "Thank you, that would be very nice." Mrs. Bellamy nodded and retreated. Miss Marple watched her go, the faintest crease appearing between her brows. People did not keep silent for no reason. Silence in a village was never empty, it was packed full of things withheld. Across the room, Mr. Crane, the retired solicitor, sat beneath the clock, pretending to read yesterday's newspaper. He had not turned a page in 20 minutes. His spectacles reflected the firelight, hiding his eyes, but his fingers tapped once, twice, then stopped whenever footsteps passed in the hall. Near the window, Miss Elspeth Vale, the organist from St. Cuthbert's, stitched at a square of white linen. Her needle moved quickly, precisely, yet Miss Marple noticed she had sewn the same seam twice. A woman may be neat by nature, but she does not mend what has already been mended unless her mind is elsewhere. Outside, the church bell gave one low note. Everyone in the parlor looked up. Only for a second. Then everyone looked down again. Miss Marple set her cup carefully into its saucer. "How very odd," she said softly. Miss Vale's needle stopped. "What is odd?" Mr. Crane asked too quickly. "The bell," said Miss Marple. "It sounded rather muffled." "It is the snow," he replied. "Of course." But his answer had come before he had considered the question. And that too was interesting. A gust of wind pushed snow against the window pane with a dry whisper. For a moment, Miss Marple saw her own reflection in the dark glass, small, composed, elderly, harmless. It was often useful to appear harmless. The parlor door opened, and young Thomas Rill stepped inside, bringing with him a breath of cold air and the damp scent of wool. He was the postman's nephew, a broad-shouldered young man with honest eyes and an unfortunate habit of looking guilty even when innocent. He removed his cap, snow clung to his hair. "Beg pardon, Mrs. Bellamy, about." "She is in the kitchen," Miss Marple said. Thomas nodded but did not move immediately. His gaze had gone to Miss Vale, then to Mr. Crane, then to the fire, as though he had expected to find someone else there. "Were you looking for a particular person?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No, miss, that is no." A little color rose in his face. Miss Vale's needle snapped. The sound was tiny, almost delicate, but in the warm quiet of the room it seemed as sharp as breaking glass. Thomas turned at once. "Miss Vale." "I am quite all right," she said. Her voice was smooth, but her fingers had gone white around the linen. Thomas swallowed whatever he had intended to say. He murmured another apology and disappeared toward the kitchen. Mr. Crane folded his newspaper with great care. "There is too much coming and going today," he said. "Is there?" Miss Marple asked. He looked at her, then smiled without warmth. "For such weather, I mean." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Weather does make people behave differently." Or gives them an excuse to do so, she thought. When Mrs. Bellamy returned from the kitchen, she seemed more flustered than before. Thomas had gone out by the back way. Miss Marple knew this because the front door had not opened, and because a faint line of melting snow now marked the flagstones near the service passage. A message delivered privately then. Or received. The fire burned lower. Evening deepened. One by one, the village lamps outside appeared through the snow, blurred and golden, like candles seen through tears. Miss Marple rose and crossed to the window. Rosewood's main street curved gently downward from the inn toward the church, past the baker, the apothecary, and the narrow lane leading to Rosewood Manor. By daylight it was charming, almost excessively so, with its painted doors and climbing roses now black beneath winter. But by lamplight, with snow falling through the silence, the village had another quality. It seemed watchful. At the apothecary's window, a figure stood behind the glass. Mr. Hargreaves, no doubt, though his face was hidden by reflection. He did not move. He simply stood there, looking toward the manor road. Miss Marple followed his gaze. At the far end of the lane, just before the trees began, a single lantern bobbed in the snow. Someone was walking away from the village. Not toward it. Miss Marple leaned slightly closer to the window. The figure was wrapped in a dark coat and moved with care, avoiding the middle of the road where footprints would be easiest to see. That detail was small, but Miss Marple had long ago learned that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are being prudent. The lantern disappeared behind the hedge. Behind her, Mr. Crane's chair scraped softly. "Admiring the snow?" he asked. "It changes everything, doesn't it?" Miss Marple said. "Yes," he replied. "It covers a great deal." Miss Marple turned. Their eyes met. For the first time, Mr. Crane looked away. A few minutes later, the supper bell rang, and the little parlor emptied with the quiet rustle of people eager to be elsewhere. Miss Vale went upstairs, saying she had a headache. Mr. Crane excused himself to write a letter. Mrs. Bellamy vanished again into the kitchen, leaving Miss Marple alone with the fire and the steady ticking of the clock. She returned to her chair and took from her pocket the linen handkerchief she had found near the manor path that morning. The embroidered initial caught the firelight. Miss Elspeth Vale, or perhaps Elena Rosewood, the mistress of the manor. Or Edmund Crane, though a gentleman might not choose so delicate a thing. 3 names, 1 initial. A handkerchief in the road. A bicycle abandoned in haste. A village afraid to speak. Miss Marple folded the linen again, very neatly. Then she noticed something she had not seen before. In one corner, almost hidden beneath the embroidery, was a faint stain. Not brown, not red, but a pale violet smudge like crushed petals. Lavender. The scent rose only when warmed by the fire. Miss Marple held the handkerchief close, her expression thoughtful. Rosewood Manor was famous for its lavender room, kept locked since old Sir Alistair died. At least that was what Mrs. Bellamy had mentioned at luncheon, before stopping herself rather suddenly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and patient, covering every roof, every path, every footprint. But not forever. Miss Marple looked toward the dark window, where the village lights trembled behind the glass. Somewhere in Rosewood, a door had been opened that should have remained closed. And before morning, she suspected, someone would be very sorry indeed. Chapter 3. The watchful eyes behind polite smiles. By the following morning, the snow had softened Rosewood Village into something almost too beautiful to distrust. It lay clean and unbroken across cottage roofs, garden walls, and the narrow churchyard path, where the old yew trees bent beneath their white burden like elderly parishioners in silent prayer. The air was cold enough to silver the breath, yet the sky above had cleared to a delicate winter blue. Sunlight touched the icicles beneath the eaves and set them gleaming like small, harmless knives. Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window in the Blue Finch Inn, fastening the top button of her wool dress. Below, the village was waking. A baker's boy carried a basket through the snow. Mrs. Bellamy shook a rug too vigorously outside the inn door. Mr. Hargreaves, the apothecary, unlocked his shop with his usual grave expression. Everything seemed ordinary. And yet, it was precisely the insistence upon ordinariness that troubled Miss Marple. When people are innocent, they behave naturally. When they are frightened, they often behave better than usual. Rosewood had become exceedingly well-behaved. At breakfast, the dining room smelled of toast, marmalade, and coal smoke. The fire glowed low in the grate, and the silver spoons had been laid with military neatness beside the china cups. Mrs. Bellamy moved among the tables with a brightness that did not reach her eyes. "Lovely morning after all, Miss Marple." "Quite lovely," Miss Marple replied. "Snow is so forgiving to look at." Mrs. Bellamy paused, forgiving. "It covers so much." The innkeeper's smile held for a moment too long. "Yes, well, more tea." Before Miss Marple could answer, the door opened and Miss Elspeth Vale entered. She was a tall woman, narrow in the shoulders, with a face composed of restraint and careful endurance. Her dark hair was pinned severely beneath a felt hat, and her gloves were spotless. Too spotless, Miss Marple noticed, considering the slush beginning to gather along the pavements. "Good morning," Miss Vale said. "Good morning," Miss Marple replied. "I trust your headache has improved." A faint flicker crossed Miss Vale's face. "How kind of you to remember. Yes, quite improved." She sat at the next table, though there were several farther away, and unfolded her napkin with delicate precision. Her eyes did not once move toward Miss Marple's pocket, where the linen handkerchief lay folded. That, too, was interesting. A guilty person looks. An anxious, innocent person also looks, but a practiced woman looks everywhere except where she longs to look. Soon after, Mr. Crane came in, walking with the measured dignity of a man accustomed to being listened to. He nodded to Miss Marple, bowed slightly to Miss Vale, and took the seat nearest the fire. "Still no word from the manor?" Mrs. Bellamy asked before she could stop herself. The room changed. Not visibly, not loudly. But the air tightened. Mr. Crane laid down his newspaper. Miss Vale's hand paused over the sugar bowl. Even the clock seemed to hesitate between ticks. "Word?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Bellamy's cheeks colored. "Only that Mrs. Rosewood usually sends down for bread by 8. The cook's boy hasn't come." "Perhaps the snow delayed him," said Mr. Crane. "There is not enough snow to delay a hungry kitchen," Miss Marple said. No one smiled. A few minutes later, she left the inn and stepped into the crisp village light. Rosewood by day had the charm of a painted Christmas card. The cottages leaned companionably against one another. Smoke curled in pale blue threads from chimneys. The church bell tower rose at the far end of the green, its stonework dusted white. Yet beneath the gentleness, Miss Marple sensed the quiet pulse of alarm. At the grocer's, 2 women stopped speaking when she entered. At the post office, old Mrs. Finch asked 3 times whether Miss Marple required stamps, though Miss Marple had requested none. At the apothecary, Mr. Hargreaves polished the same glass bottle until it nearly vanished beneath his cloth. "You have been busy this morning," Miss Marple observed. "Not especially." "Then perhaps anxious." His hand stilled. "Anxious? Why should I be anxious?" "People generally ask that question when they have a reason." Mr. Hargreaves smiled, but it was a thin, papery thing. Behind him on a high shelf stood rows of tinctures and powders, each neatly labeled. Lavender oil, tonic of valerian, laudanum. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the last bottle for no more than a breath. "Mrs. Rosewood takes medicine, does she not?" she asked. "Many people take medicine." "Of course, but not all send servants by the back lane at odd hours." The cloth dropped from his hand. For the first time, his composure cracked. "Village servants gossip," he said softly. "And apothecaries listen." He turned away, reaching for a ledger. "I cannot discuss customers." "No, that would be improper." Miss Marple allowed the word to settle between them. Impropriety, she had found, frightened respectable people far more than wickedness. As she left, she heard the faintest sound behind her, the hurried closing of a drawer. Outside, the sun had risen higher, and snowmelt dripped from the eaves in slow, patient drops. Near the church gate, Thomas Rill stood with a sack of letters over one shoulder, speaking to Miss Vale. Their heads were close, their voices low. When they saw Miss Marple, they separated at once. "Good morning again," Miss Marple said. Thomas fumbled with his cap. "Morning, miss." Miss Vale's expression was cool. "You are taking quite an interest in our village." "I have always found villages interesting." "There is very little here to interest anyone." "How fortunate for you all." The words were mild, but Miss Vale understood them. Her mouth tightened. Thomas looked miserable. Miss Marple turned to him. "You deliver to Rosewood Manor, I believe." "Yes, miss." "And this morning?" He hesitated. Miss Vale's gloved fingers closed around the iron gate. "No answer," Thomas said at last. "I left the letters in the box." "At the front door?" "Yes." Miss Marple looked at his boots. Snow clung to the sides, but a streak of dark mud marked the heel. The manor road was snow-covered. The back lane by the old greenhouse was mud. "How practical," she murmured. Thomas flushed deeply. Before she could speak further, the church door opened. Reverend Selwyn appeared, tall and silver-haired, wrapped in a black cloak. His smile was gentle, but his eyes were tired. "Miss Marple, I hope Rosewood is treating you kindly." "Very kindly, almost too kindly." He glanced toward Miss Vale, then Thomas. "We are a close village." "Yes, that can be a comfort." "And a burden," he said. The words were spoken quietly, but Miss Marple heard the weight inside them. A gust of wind stirred snow from the yew branches. It fell in a soft white veil between them. For a moment, no one moved. Then from the direction of Rosewood Manor came a sound that did not belong to the peaceful morning. A bell, not the church bell. A smaller one, sharp and frantic, ringing again and again from the great house beyond the trees. The village froze. Mrs. Bellamy appeared in the inn doorway. Mr. Hargreaves stepped out of his shop. Windows opened along the green. Faces emerged, pale in the cold light. Still the bell rang. Miss Marple turned toward the manor road. Miss Vale whispered something Miss Marple almost did not catch. Too late. Thomas looked at her, stricken. The Reverend closed his eyes for one brief second, as if he had been expecting this and dreading it all the same. Miss Marple began to walk. No one asked where she was going. No one offered to accompany her. But as she passed the cottages, she felt their eyes following. Watchful eyes behind lace curtains, behind polished glass, behind polite village faces that had smiled too carefully for too long. At the bend in the lane, she paused and looked back. Rosewood stood behind her in perfect winter brightness, charming, quiet, respectable, and full of secrets. Then the bell at the manor stopped. The sudden silence was far worse. Miss Marple tightened her shawl around her shoulders and continued toward the house. Chapter 4. The Stillness of Death at Rosewood Manor. Rosewood Manor stood at the end of the lane like a memory the village had tried to forget. Its gray stone walls rose behind iron gates dusted with snow, the windows dark and narrow beneath their ledges of white. Ivy clung to the eastern side in black, twisting veins, and the bare branches of the chestnut trees scraped softly against one another in the wind, making a dry whispering sound that followed Miss Marple as she approached. The bell had stopped. That was what troubled her most. A ringing bell suggests panic, urgency, the living hand calling out for help. Silence afterward suggests something quite different. The front gate hung open, not wide, not invitingly, but by a careful measure, as though someone had passed through and thought better of closing it fully. Miss Marple paused just inside, looking down. Snow covered the gravel, but near the left post she noticed a disturbance, a scuffed print, half filled already by the continuing fall, and beside it the faint curve of a wheel track. Not a carriage. A bicycle. She continued up the drive. At the top of the steps, the great front door stood shut. A brass lion's head knocker gazed out over the white grounds with blind authority. Miss Marple lifted it and let it fall once. The sound echoed within. For several moments, nothing happened. Then there came footsteps, hurried but uneven, and the door opened a cautious few inches. A young maid looked out. Her cap was crooked and her eyes were red-rimmed. "Oh," she whispered, "Miss Marple." "Good morning, Edith." The girl seemed surprised that her name was known. Servants often were. Miss Marple had always thought it wise to know the names of those who saw everything and were asked about nothing. "I heard the bell," Miss Marple said. Edith's lips trembled. It was Mrs. Price who rang it, the cook, she found. The girl stopped. "Found what, my dear?" Edith swallowed. Not what, who? The door opened wider. Warmth did not greet Miss Marple as she stepped inside. The hall was bitterly cold, colder even than the air outside, as though the house had ceased trying to be inhabited. A faint smell lingered beneath the wax polish and old flowers. Lavender, smoke, and something metallic that did not announce itself loudly, but waited at the edge of perception. The entrance hall rose high above them, paneled in dark oak. Portraits of stern Rosewood ancestors looked down from gilded frames, their painted eyes fixed upon the morning's disturbance with ancestral disapproval. A long runner carpet led toward the staircase, its red pattern dimmed by years of use. On a side table beneath the mirror lay several letters, unopened. Miss Marple noticed one with wet edges. Someone had carried it in through snow. "Where is Mrs. Price now?" she asked. "In the morning room, miss, with Mr. Edmund." "Mr. Edmund Crane." "No, miss, Mr. Edmund Rosewood, Mrs. Rosewood's nephew." Of course, another E. Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly. "Take me to them, please." The morning room was small compared to the rest of the house, but more human, A fire had been lit, though it had not yet taken properly. Smoke curled sluggishly at the back of the grate. Heavy curtains were drawn halfway, allowing in a pale winter light that turned the furniture silver at the edges. Mrs. Price sat rigidly on a chair near the hearth, her flour-dusted hands clenched in her apron. Beside the window stood a young man of perhaps 35, fair-haired, well-dressed, and unpleasantly pale. He turned as Miss Marple entered. "Who allowed you in?" he said. His voice was not rude by habit, it was rude from strain. "I allowed myself to be useful," Miss Marple replied. Edmund Rosewood stared, then gave a short, brittle laugh. "Useful? My aunt is dead." Mrs. Price made a low sound and pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Miss Marple looked at Edmund carefully. His grief was visible, certainly. But grief, like illness, has many symptoms and not all of them honest. "I am very sorry," she said. "Where is she?" He hesitated. "Mr. Rosewood," Miss Marple prompted. "In the lavender room." Mrs. Price looked up sharply. "It were locked, miss. Locked these 7 years it was." "Then how was it opened?" "No one knows," Edmund said. But he did not look at the cook when he said it. Miss Marple followed them down a corridor where the air grew stiller with every step. The house seemed to absorb sound. Even their footsteps sank into the carpet as though reluctant to disturb the dead. The lavender room lay at the back of the manor, overlooking a neglected garden where snow had buried the flower beds. Its door was painted white, though time had yellowed it. The key remained in the lock. Miss Marple paused there. "Was the key usually kept here?" "No," said Mrs. Price. "Never. Sir Alistair had it on his chain when he was alive. After he died, Mrs. Rosewood kept it in her writing desk." "And who had access to the desk?" "No one," Edmund said quickly. Miss Marple looked at him. "No one." He flushed. "I mean, my aunt was particular." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Particular people often are." The door opened with a soft click. Lavender met them at once, not fresh but dry and faded, the scent of old sachets tucked into drawers and forgotten. The room had been preserved rather than lived in. Dust lay along the mantel, untouched except where something had recently disturbed it. A portrait of Sir Alistair Rosewood hung above the fireplace, his severe face looking down upon the room he had once forbidden anyone to alter. And in the armchair near the cold hearth sat Alina Rosewood. She looked almost asleep. Her silver hair was neatly arranged, her dark dress unwrinkled, her hands resting in her lap. There was no violence about the scene, no disorder, no dramatic cruelty, only stillness. But stillness can be the most eloquent sign of all. On the small table beside her stood a cup of tea, half full. Beside it lay a book, open face down, and a silver teaspoon placed not on the saucer but directly on the polished wood. Miss Marple moved closer slowly. "She always took tea at 9:30, Mrs. Price whispered. "In her sitting room, never here." "Who brought the tea?" "I did, miss, to her sitting room, same as always." "And the cup was later found here." Mrs. Price nodded, trembling. Miss Marple bent over the cup without touching it. A faint ring marked the inside porcelain, darker than ordinary tea. The liquid had a bitter scent beneath the bergamot. At the hearth, though no fire had burned there, lay a pinch of gray ash. Not coal ash. Paper. Something had been burned recently, but incompletely. Near the grate, Miss Marple saw a blackened scrap curled like a dead leaf. On it, only 3 letters remained visible. Ven. Heaven 7 proven. Or perhaps a name. She straightened. "Who discovered Mrs. Rosewood?" "I did," said Mrs. Price. "When she didn't ring, I came looking." "Why here?" The cook's face changed. "Because," she faltered. "Because someone told you to look here?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Price began to cry. Edmund stepped forward. "This is intolerable." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Death often is." His mouth tightened. She turned her attention to the window. It was closed, but the latch was not fully fastened. On the inside sill lay 2 small beads of melted snow. Someone had opened it after the snow began. Outside, beneath the window, the garden lay white and apparently undisturbed. But snow can deceive from above. It smooths over detail, softens edges, makes certainty appear pure. Miss Marple looked back at the body, the cup, the ash, the locked door, the window. A room locked for 7 years. A dead woman seated as though invited. A bell rung too late. And somewhere in the village, a handkerchief marked with E and scented with lavender. "Has anyone sent for the police?" she asked. Edmund hesitated one fraction too long. "I was about to." "Were you?" The room grew colder. From the corridor came the distant sound of the front door opening, then voices. Reverend Selwyn, Mr. Hargreaves, perhaps others. The village was arriving, drawn by fear, curiosity, or guilt. Miss Marple glanced once more at Alina Rosewood's peaceful face. People often imagine murder to be loud, desperate, untidy. But the cleverest murders resembled accidents, illnesses, prayers answered quietly in old rooms. She stepped back from the armchair. "Nothing must be moved," she said. Edmund gave a thin smile. "You speak as though you are in charge." "No," said Miss Marple, looking toward the cold hearth. "I speak as though someone has taken great trouble to make us believe a story." The snow tapped softly against the window. "And I should very much like to know why they chose this room in which to tell it." Chapter 5. Whispers beneath teacups and candlelight. By evening, Rosewood Manor had become a house of lowered voices. Snow pressed against the tall windows, gathering in the corners of the panes like pale breath. The corridors were lit by candle sconces, their flames bending whenever a door opened, then recovering themselves with small, stubborn shivers. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees with a sound like silk being drawn slowly across the floor. Inside, no one spoke above a murmur. The body of Alina Rosewood had been removed from the lavender room, but her presence remained there more strongly than before. Death, Miss Marple had often observed, has a curious habit of occupying a room after the dead have left it. Chairs seem to remember. Curtains hang more heavily. Even the dust appears to settle with intention. Inspector Haldon had arrived from the nearest town just after dusk, a broad, thoughtful man with tired eyes and snow on the shoulders of his coat. He listened politely while Edmund Rosewood explained matters with an anxious fluency that made Miss Marple look at him twice. "My aunt was elderly," Edmund said. "Her heart was weak, the doctor will confirm it." "Then why send for the police?" asked the inspector. Edmund blinked, because Mrs. Price became hysterical. Mrs. Price, seated near the fire, stiffened but did not protest. Miss Marple watched the cook's hands. They twisted her apron once, then stilled. A woman who wished to defend herself would have spoken. A woman afraid of saying too much remained silent. The inspector turned to Miss Marple. "You were present before I arrived." "I came when the bell rang," she said. "And noticed." "Several small things. Small things are so often more faithful than large ones." Edmund gave a soft, impatient sigh. The inspector's mouth twitched as though he might have smiled under different circumstances. "We shall take tea in the drawing room," he said. "It is easier to hear people when they are warm." So they gathered there, drawn not by hospitality, but by necessity. The drawing room was long and faded, with velvet chairs, a marble fireplace, and shelves of books whose gilded spines had dulled with age. A fire had been built high, and its glow moved over polished tables, silver frames, and the pale faces of those assembled. Miss Vale sat upright near the candles, her hands folded too neatly. Reverend Selwyn stood by the mantel, his gaze fixed upon the flames. Mr. Hargreaves, the apothecary, had positioned himself in shadow, though the room was large enough to make that seem accidental. Thomas Rill hovered near the door, as if uncertain whether he had been invited or trapped. Mrs. Bellamy had also come, having insisted upon bringing a basket of rolls and cold ham, though no one could possibly have wanted supper. She sat with the basket in her lap, eyes moving from person to person, collecting fear as naturally as gossip. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea. The porcelain was thin, warm against her fingers. The liquid smelled of Darjeeling and lemon. No bitterness, no lavender. That absence, too, told her something. Inspector Haldon began gently. "Mrs. Rosewood was last seen alive this morning." "At 9:30, Mrs. Price said. "I took her tea to the little sitting room." "Was she alone?" "Yes, sir." "Did she seem distressed?" The cook hesitated. Edmund looked sharply at her. Miss Marple lowered her eyes to her teacup. Mrs. Price said she had been expecting someone. The room grew still. "Who?" asked the inspector. "I don't know, sir. She said only, if they come, tell them I will receive them in the proper room." "The proper room?" Miss Marple repeated softly. Mrs. Price nodded. "That is what she said." Edmund's face flushed. "My aunt often spoke obscurely. She enjoyed making people uncomfortable." "Did she?" asked Miss Marple. "She was a difficult woman. Difficult people are often those who remember too much." Reverend Selwyn shifted by the fire. Inspector Haldon turned to him. "You visited Mrs. Rosewood yesterday." The Reverend's expression remained calm, but his hand closed around the edge of the mantle. "I called in the afternoon." "Why?" "To discuss a memorial donation for the church roof." "Was Miss Vale present?" The question came gently, but Miss Vale's head lifted. "I arrived as Reverend Selwyn was leaving," she said. "To discuss music?" Miss Marple asked. Miss Vale looked at her. Mrs. Rosewood disliked music. "How unusual." "She disliked many things." "And yet you came." A pause. "She had written to me," Miss Vale said at last. Edmund turned. "You never mentioned that." "I saw no reason." "Perhaps you will see one now," said the inspector. Miss Vale's eyes moved toward the window, where the snow reflected the candlelight in ghostly flickers. "Mrs. Rosewood believed I possessed something belonging to her family. She was mistaken." "What was it?" asked Haldon. "A letter." The word entered the room quietly, but it seemed to disturb every candle flame. Miss Marple set her cup down without sound. "A recent letter?" she asked. "No." Miss Vale's voice thinned. "An old one." Mr. Hargreaves spoke from the shadows. "Old letters rarely matter unless someone has kept them too long." Miss Marple turned to him. "You speak from experience." He gave a faint bow. "From observation." "Observation," said Miss Marple, "is an excellent habit, though sometimes inconvenient." Mrs. Bellamy swallowed audibly. The inspector looked from face to face. Was there a letter burned in the lavender room? No one answered. The fire cracked softly. Miss Marple thought of the scrap in the grate. 3 letters, Ven. Edmund stood abruptly. "This is absurd. My aunt died in a locked room of natural causes, surrounded by melodrama because certain people cannot resist imagining intrigue." "Locked rooms are very comforting," Miss Marple said. He stared at her. "Comforting. They tell us no one could have entered, therefore no one need be suspected. It is a very tidy arrangement." "Are you accusing me?" "I am wondering why you are so anxious to be accused." The air seemed to thin. Thomas Rill made a small movement near the door. Miss Marple noticed his eyes were fixed not on Edmund, but on Miss Vale. Protective, fearful. Young men look that way when they have promised something without understanding its cost. Inspector Haldon saw it too. "Mr. Rill, you delivered letters to the manor this morning." "Yes, sir." "At what time?" "Just before 9. "Did Mrs. Rosewood receive them?" "No, sir, I left them." "At the front door?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Yes." Miss Marple said gently, "And afterward you went by the back lane." Thomas looked stricken. Miss Vale whispered, "Don't." It was barely audible, but everyone heard. The inspector turned to her. What must he not do? Miss Vale's composure finally trembled. "Nothing, I only meant he is a foolish boy, he becomes confused." Thomas lifted his head. "I am not confused." The candles fluttered in a draft. He took one step forward. "Mrs. Rosewood asked me to carry a note yesterday evening to Miss Vale." Edmund's eyes narrowed. "What note?" Thomas looked at Miss Vale, apology written plainly across his face. "She said Miss Vale was to come to the manor by the garden door after dark. She said it concerned the lavender room." Miss Vale closed her eyes. Reverend Selwyn murmured, "Elspeth." Miss Marple heard something in the name, not reproach, sorrow. Mrs. Bellamy leaned forward, helplessly hungry for every word. "And did Miss Vale come?" asked Haldon. Miss Vale opened her eyes. "Yes." A log collapsed in the grate, sending up a brief golden shower of sparks. "I went," she said, "but I did not kill her." "No one said you did," Miss Marple replied. Miss Vale's face became very pale. Outside, the wind pressed snow against the glass. Inside, the drawing room seemed smaller now, every chair too close, every breath too audible. "What happened?" asked the inspector. Miss Vale spoke carefully. "Mrs. Rosewood unlocked the lavender room. She showed me a packet of letters tied with blue ribbon. She said they proved a scandal from years ago. She said my mother had ruined the Rosewood name." "And had she?" Miss Marple asked. Miss Vale's eyes shone, though no tears fell. "No, Elena Rosewood ruined my mother, then hid behind mourning and respectability for 30 years. Silence followed. Not empty silence. A silence full of rearranging truths. Edmund said hoarsely, "Where are those letters now?" Miss Vale looked at him. "I don't know." But Miss Marple noticed Mr. Hargreaves's hand move inside his coat pocket, then stop. A very small movement. A very large mistake. The inspector noticed Miss Marple noticing. She lifted her teacup once more, though the tea had gone cold. In the firelight, everyone looked softened, almost kind. But candlelight is a forgiving liar. It hides sharp edges. It makes guilt look like grief and fear look like dignity. Miss Marple looked around the room. The nephew too eager for natural death. The organist guarding an old shame. The postman's nephew burdened by loyalty. The reverend wounded by memory. The apothecary with secrets in his pocket. "So many whispers," she said softly, and beneath every whisper a little truth trying to breathe. At that moment, from somewhere deep in the house, came a sound. 3 soft notes. Not the bell. A piano. Miss Vale rose so quickly her cup fell and shattered on the carpet. "That room is locked," she whispered. Miss Marple turned toward the dark hallway. "Apparently," she said, "not anymore." Chapter 6. Fractured alibis and hidden correspondences. The 3 piano notes faded into the corridors of Rosewood Manor like a question no one wished to answer. For a moment, nobody moved. The shattered teacup lay on the carpet at Miss Vale's feet, its dark stain spreading slowly through the pale wool-like ink through blotting paper. Outside, snow whispered against the windows. Inside, every face had turned toward the hallway. Inspector Haldon set down his notebook. "Who is at the piano?" No one replied. Miss Marple rose carefully, drawing her shawl closer about her shoulders. "That, Inspector, is precisely what we ought to discover." The sound had come from the music room, a narrow chamber at the far end of the east corridor. It had once been fashionable, no doubt, with its gilt mirror, painted ceiling, and tall windows facing the frozen garden. But now the room had the faded air of something abandoned to memory. Dust lay on the closed pianoforte, except for 3 clean marks upon the ivory keys. Miss Vale stood in the doorway, breathing shallowly. "It was played," said Thomas Rill. "Or made to seem so," Miss Marple murmured. Inspector Haldon lifted the lid more fully. A thin thread of black ribbon was tied to 3 adjacent keys and led down behind the instrument, where it disappeared beneath the carpet. Edmund Rosewood gave a strained laugh, a parlor trick. "A rather deliberate one," said the inspector. Miss Marple bent slightly, not touching the ribbon. Near the pedal was a small puddle of melted snow. Beside it, a fragment of brown paper clung to the carpet. She looked toward the window. It was closed but not latched. "Someone came in from outside," Haldon said. "Or wished us to think so," said Miss Marple. Edmund turned sharply. "Must every fact be doubted?" "Only the convenient ones," she replied. The inspector ordered the room left undisturbed, then returned the household and visitors to the drawing room, where the fire had burned low and the candles had shortened in their holders. The shadows were deeper now. Faces that had seemed merely anxious before appeared carved by private histories. "One by one," said Haldon. "We shall begin again. Mrs. Rosewood died sometime between 9:30 and 11 this morning. I want every movement accounted for." Edmund folded his arms. "I was in the library from 9 until 11. Mrs. Price can confirm she brought me coffee." "At 10, said Mrs. Price. "At 10, yes." "And before 10. Edmund's jaw tightened. "Alone." Miss Marple looked at the silver coffee tray still resting on a side table. 1 cup, One saucer, a faint brown ring. Did you drink the coffee, Mr. Rosewood? He frowned. What possible relevance? None, perhaps. Mrs. Price looked up slowly. He did not, miss. Leastways, the cup was full when I took it away. I was distracted, Edmund snapped. By what? Asked Haldon. No answer came. Miss Vale sat near the candles, her face pale and composed again, but her hands betrayed her. Her fingers moved faintly, as though playing silent chords upon her lap. And you, Miss Vale, said the inspector. I was at the church, practicing. Can anyone confirm that? The church was empty. Thomas Rill stepped forward. I heard the organ. Miss Vale turned. Thomas. I did, he insisted, at 10:15. Miss Marple's eyes softened. From where did you hear it? The lane by the churchyard. And you were there because... Thomas swallowed. I had finished the manor delivery. You said earlier you left the letters at the front door before 9, said Haldon. I did. Then why were you still near the church at 10:15? The young man flushed miserably. Miss Vale closed her eyes again. I was waiting, Thomas said. For whom? For Miss Vale. A small, unhappy silence followed. Miss Vale spoke without looking at him. He is loyal, that is all. Loyalty, said Miss Marple, can make people very careless with truth. Thomas looked as though the words had struck him harder than an accusation. Mr. Hargreaves, who had been standing in shadow, said, If we are to examine devotion, we may be here until dawn. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, but dawn is often helpful. Haldon turned to him. Your movements? In my shop all morning. Customers? A few. Names? Mr. Hargreaves hesitated. Mrs. Finch, a farmhand, Mrs. Bellamy. Mrs. Bellamy sat upright. I came for bicarbonate, nothing mysterious in indigestion. No, Miss Marple said pleasantly, though indigestion often follows anxiety. The innkeeper blushed. Haldon glanced at his notes. Mr. Hargreaves, did you supply laudanum to Mrs. Rosewood? I supplied many preparations. That is not an answer. The apothecary's face hardened. Yes, in small prescribed quantities. And recently? 2 days ago. Miss Marple folded her hands. With lavender oil. His eyes flickered. Lavender oil is harmless, he said. Most harmless things are, until they are used to conceal something less so. The fire gave a soft collapse, sending embers glowing like watchful eyes. Reverend Selwyn, who had been silent too long, said, This must end. Alina Rosewood had enemies because she cultivated injury, but none of us wished her dead. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. Are you quite sure, Reverend? His expression changed, not anger but pain. One may despise what a person has done and still pray for their soul. And what had she done? The question rested in the room. Miss Vale's voice came quietly. She kept letters. Edmund turned on her. You keep saying that as if it explains everything. It may, said Miss Marple. The inspector nodded. Where did these letters come from? Miss Vale stared into the candle flame. My mother was companion to Alina Rosewood before her marriage. There was a scandal, a child, a sum of money, a disappearance. My mother was accused of theft and dismissed. She never recovered her reputation. And the letters proved otherwise. They proved that Sir Alistair Rosewood had arranged everything. Alina knew. She let my mother be ruined. Thomas whispered, Why did Mrs. Rosewood bring it up now? Miss Vale's mouth trembled, because she wished to buy back silence from the dead. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, or from the living. Miss Vale looked away. Haldon said, Where are the letters? I do not know. But this time the lie did not belong to her alone. Miss Marple saw it pass through the room like a draft. Edmund's tightened mouth, Hargreaves's stillness, the Reverend's lowered eyes, Mrs. Bellamy's restless fingers upon her basket handle. More than one person knew of the letters. More than one had searched for them. Miss Marple asked to see Mrs. Rosewood's writing desk. They found it in the private sitting room, a pretty walnut piece positioned beside a window overlooking the side garden. The room smelled faintly of rose soap and cold ashes. A porcelain shepherdess stood on the mantel. A clock ticked steadily, as though determined not to be affected by death. The desk was locked. Edmund produced a key from his waistcoat pocket. "You carry it?" asked Haldon. "My aunt gave it to me yesterday. She asked me to review certain estate papers." "Did she indeed?" Miss Marple said. He opened the desk. Inside were envelopes, account books, sealing wax, a small silver knife, and an empty space at the back of the middle drawer where dust had gathered around the outline of a rectangular packet. Something had lain there for years. Something recently removed. Miss Marple touched the dust lightly with her eyes, not her hands. "Blue ribbon," she said. Miss Vale's breath caught. Behind the envelopes, the inspector found a torn sheet of paper. It was a note in Alina Rosewood's firm, old-fashioned hand. "If I am to be threatened in my own house, then we shall speak where he cannot avoid hearing the truth." No name. No signature. Only a time, 10 o'clock. Miss Marple gazed at the words for a long moment. "Where he cannot avoid hearing," she repeated. "The lavender room?" asked Haldon. "Perhaps, or a room with a portrait. The dead can be very useful witnesses to the guilty conscience." Edmund gave a sharp exhale. "This is nonsense." But his voice had lost its earlier strength. As they left the sitting room, Miss Marple noticed Thomas lingering by the corridor table where the Morning Post had lain. One envelope remained there, pushed partly beneath a silver tray. She drew it out. It was addressed to Alina Rosewood in a hand neat, controlled, and unmistakably feminine. The postmark was 3 days old. The seal had been broken. Inside was a single blank sheet. No words, only the scent of lavender. And pressed into the fold, one dry petal almost black with age. Miss Marple looked toward Miss Vale. "No," Miss Vale whispered, "I did not send that." "I believe you," said Miss Marple. That startled everyone. The inspector asked why. "Because this is not a message. It is a summons, and Miss Vale was not summoning Mrs. Rosewood." She folded the sheet carefully. Mrs. Rosewood was being reminded. "Of what?" asked Thomas. Miss Marple looked down the long corridor toward the lavender room, where the candles still burned faintly beyond the bend. "Of something that began long before this morning," she said, "and of someone she should never have trusted enough to invite inside." Chapter 7. The comforting lie that almost settles. By midnight, Rosewood Manor had grown weary of suspicion. The snow had stopped falling, but its silence remained, settled thickly upon the roof, the window ledges, and the long dark lawns beyond the glass. Inside, the fires burned low in their grates, and the candles had shortened to pools of wax, their flames small and patient, like eyes refusing to close. In the drawing room, everyone waited. Inspector Haldon stood beside the mantel, his notebook open. Edmund Rosewood sat with one leg crossed over the other, though his foot trembled faintly. Miss Vale had withdrawn into the shadow near the pianoforte, her face pale beneath the candlelight. Reverend Selwyn clasped his hands behind his back. Mr. Hargreaves watched the fire as if it might betray him. Thomas Rill stood at the door, anxious and young, carrying more fear than guilt, though fear often wears guilt's coat. Mrs. Bellamy had gone quiet at last. Miss Marple sat in a low chair near the hearth, her knitting on her lap, though she had not made a stitch. Inspector Haldon cleared his throat. "We have a likely account," he said. No one breathed easily. Mrs. Rosewood received a warning connected to old family letters. She summoned Miss Vale to the manor last night and later arranged to meet someone this morning in the lavender room. The tea was moved there. The room, though once locked, was opened with a key from Mrs. Rosewood's desk. A sedative or poison was introduced into her cup. Miss Vale closed her eyes. The inspector continued. "The piano trick appears to have been set later, perhaps to suggest an intruder, perhaps to confuse the time of entry. There were traces of snow beneath the window. Thomas Rill admits he went by the back lane. Miss Vale admits she visited the manor by the garden door the previous night. She had motive." Thomas stepped forward. "No." Miss Vale opened her eyes but did not look at him. Inspector Haldon's voice remained gentle. She had knowledge of the letters, she had resentment, she had opportunity. "I said no," Thomas repeated more softly this time. "You cannot help her by lying," said Edmund. Thomas turned on him with sudden heat, and you cannot help yourself by smiling before she is arrested. The room stiffened. Edmund's face darkened, careful. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. There it was, the first true thing Edmund had said all evening. Careful. Not innocent, not mistaken, careful. Inspector Haldon raised a hand. Enough, Miss Vale, I must ask plainly, did you return to the manor this morning? Miss Vale sat very still. Her composed face seemed carved from winter ivory. No. Thomas whispered, tell them where you were. She said nothing. Tell them. Her silence became a room of its own. At last, Reverend Selwyn spoke. She was at the church. Inspector Haldon turned. You can confirm that. The Reverend's eyes moved once to Miss Vale, then away. I heard the organ. So did Thomas, said Edmund sharply, conveniently. But neither of you saw her, Miss Marple murmured. The room turned toward her. She smiled faintly, almost apologetically. Music can be played by hands, of course, but it can also be remembered or arranged. Miss Vale looked at her then. There was fear in her face, but also something like gratitude. Inspector Haldon frowned. You think the organ was a false alibi? I think, said Miss Marple, that people in distress sometimes accept any story that feels kinder than the truth. The words settled gently. A comforting lie. That was what the village wanted. One person to blame, one old resentment brought to its expected conclusion. The wronged daughter of a ruined woman returning in cold dignity to punish the lady who had destroyed her family. It was tragic, elegant, almost literary. And therefore much too neat. Edmund leaned forward. Miss Marple, with respect, are you suggesting we ignore the obvious? Oh no, said Miss Marple. The obvious is very useful. It shows us what someone hoped we would see. Mr. Hargreaves gave a dry laugh. And what did someone hope? That Miss Vale would be suspected. Miss Vale's hand tightened on the arm of her chair. Indeed, said Edmund. Miss Marple turned to him. The handkerchief found near the manor path bore the initial E. The lavender scent suggested the locked room. The old letters suggested Miss Vale. Her silence suggested guilt. It all leads very gracefully in one direction. Because that direction is true. Perhaps. But she said it so mildly that no one believed she meant it. The inspector closed his notebook. Miss Marple, if not Miss Vale, then who? She did not answer at once. Instead, she looked at the tea table. At the cups left from the long interrogation. At the silver spoons, some resting neatly upon saucers, one placed upon the polished wood. At the lemon slices curling on a dish. At the sugar tongs aligned precisely beside the bowl. Mrs. Rosewood was particular, she said. Edmund sighed. We have established that. Particular people repeat themselves. Their habits are grooves in the day. They take tea in the same room, from the same cup, with the same measure of sugar at the same hour. Mrs. Price, who had been sitting silently near the door, nodded. One sugar, always stirred 12 times, spoon on the saucer, never on the table. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yet in the lavender room, the spoon lay on the table. Inspector Haldon looked up. I assumed, he said slowly, that someone else had served her. Or that someone wished us to believe she had drunk the tea willingly there. Edmund's voice sharpened. This is absurdly delicate reasoning. Murder often is, said Miss Marple, especially when committed by someone delicate enough to fear scandal more than death. A gust of wind pressed against the windows. The candle flames leaned together, then straightened. Inspector Haldon asked, What are you suggesting? I am suggesting Mrs. Rosewood may have died elsewhere. Silence. Then Mrs. Bellamy gasped. Miss Marple continued softly. The cup was in the lavender room, yes. The body was in the lavender room, yes. But the spoon, the cold hearth, the incomplete ash, the open window, the piano trick, all of it may have been set to create a little theater. Thomas whispered, Then someone moved her. A frail, elderly lady, said Miss Marple. Not impossible, especially if she had already taken something to make her sleep. Mr. Hargreaves shifted. This time everyone saw it. Inspector Haldon turned. You supplied laudanum 2 days ago. In prescribed quantities, Hargreaves said. To Mrs. Rosewood. Yes. Did anyone else purchase it? No. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. That is not quite the same as saying no one else received it. The apothecary's mouth tightened. Reverend Selwyn said quietly, Hargreaves. Do not, the apothecary snapped. The word struck the room with surprising force. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Ah. Edmund stood. This is nonsense. We had a simple explanation, and now you are tangling it into village superstition. A simple explanation is most comforting when everyone is tired, Miss Marple said. But comfort is not the same as truth. Inspector Haldon moved toward Mr. Hargreaves. What are you hiding? The apothecary looked suddenly old. Not murder. Then what? He reached slowly into his coat and withdrew a packet tied with blue ribbon. Miss Vale gave a broken sound. The letters, whispered Mrs. Bellamy. Hargreaves placed them on the table as though they burned his hand. Eleanor gave them to me last night. She said they must be kept safe until morning. She said if anything happened to her, they were to go to the inspector. And you said nothing? Haldon demanded. I was afraid. Of whom? Hargreaves looked not at Miss Vale, nor Thomas, nor the Reverend. He looked at Edmund. The young man's face had gone very still. Miss Marple noticed the stillness. So did everyone else. Edmund laughed once softly. This is becoming theatrical. Yes, said Miss Marple, but not in the way you intended. The inspector untied the blue ribbon. The old letters rustled faintly, dry as autumn leaves. As he read the first page, his expression changed. Miss Vale stood, trembling. What is it? Thomas asked. Haldon looked up. These letters do not merely clear Miss Vale's mother, he said. They concern inheritance. Edmund's hand closed around the back of his chair. Miss Marple watched him with sorrowful attention. The comforting lie, she said gently, was that this was all about old shame, but old shame rarely kills by itself. She looked toward the dark corridor leading to the lavender room. Money, however, is a much less sentimental murderer. The fire sank lower, and in that deepening quiet, the suspicion that had nearly settled upon Miss Vale lifted slowly, like mist from a grave, and drifted toward another name. Chapter 8. Threads of truth beneath gentle observations. Morning came slowly to Rosewood Manor, not with brightness, but with a pale, hesitant glow behind the snow clouds. The house seemed quieter after the long night of questions. Its fires had burned down to ash. Its candles had guttered and died. In the corridors, the smell of smoke and beeswax lingered faintly, mingling with the dry perfume of lavender that seemed to have escaped the locked room and drifted everywhere. Miss Marple stood alone in the breakfast room, looking out over the white garden. The snow had hardened overnight, taking on a thin crust that glittered in the weak light. Footprints lay preserved upon it now, no longer soft impressions but clear records of movement. Who had crossed the lawn, who had approached the window, who had tried to step where the shadows of the trees might hide them. Footprints like people told the truth most plainly after pressure had been applied. Inspector Haldon entered carrying the packet of letters tied once more with blue ribbon. You were right, he said. Miss Marple turned from the window. How very kind of you to say so, Inspector, though I find it is often more useful to say so after the matter is finished. He smiled faintly. The letters alter everything. Yes. They show Sir Alistair had a child before his marriage. The child was sent away. Money was paid. Miss Vale's mother was accused of theft to conceal the arrangement. And the child? Miss Marple asked. Haldon opened the top letter, though he clearly knew the line by heart. A boy, later adopted under another name. Miss Marple nodded, and if that boy had descendants, they might have a claim, perhaps not a clean one legally, but enough to disturb inheritance, enough to shame the family, enough to alarm Edmund Rosewood. Enough, Miss Marple said softly, to make an elderly woman dangerous. The inspector looked toward the garden. Do you think Eleanor intended to change her will? I think she had already begun. At that moment, Mrs. Price appeared at the doorway, pale with lack of sleep. Her cap was neat, but her hands shook around a folded cloth. Beg pardon, Miss Inspector. I found this in the laundry basket. She laid the cloth upon the table. It was a linen napkin, damp at one corner, stained faintly brown and carrying a bitter medicinal scent beneath the soap. Miss Marple leaned closer, not touching. "Laudanum?" asked Haldon. "Perhaps, or something made to resemble it." Mrs. Price whispered, "It were in Mr. Edmund's room." The inspector looked up sharply. The cook flinched. "I do not mean I went searching. The sheets were sent down. It fell from inside." Miss Marple studied the napkin. A careless hiding place, unless it had not been meant to remain hidden. Unless it had been placed where a frightened servant would find it and become frightened enough to speak. "Mrs. Price," she said gently, "who gave you the sheets?" The cook blinked. "Edith, miss." "And who told Edith to strip the room?" Mrs. Price frowned, thinking. Mr. Edmund did, said he could not sleep in a room touched by death. "How dramatic," Miss Marple murmured. Haldon folded the napkin into paper. "It points to him." "It points very nicely," said Miss Marple. He looked at her too nicely. Almost everything in this house points too nicely. By 10 o'clock, those still entangled in the matter had gathered once more in the drawing room. Daylight had replaced candlelight, but it did not make the room less secretive. The windows showed a world clean and bright. The faces within remained shadowed. Edmund stood by the sideboard, composed again, dressed in dark mourning as if he had planned the costume before the grief. Miss Vale sat near the window, exhausted but steady. Thomas remained behind her chair, though at a respectful distance. Mr. Hargreaves had not slept. The deep lines around his mouth gave him a look of defeated honesty. Reverend Selwyn stood with his hands clasped, his eyes heavy with memories he had not yet offered. Miss Marple took the chair nearest the fire. Inspector Haldon placed the napkin on the table. This was found among Mr. Rosewood's laundry. Edmund stared at it. "I have never seen it." "Convenient," said Thomas. Edmund's eyes flashed. "Do be quiet." "Why?" Miss Marple asked. "Young people often say useful things when they are angry." Thomas flushed but did not speak again. Haldon continued. "The scent is consistent with the drug used to sedate Mrs. Rosewood." "Consistent," Edmund repeated. "A pleasant word, it means you do not know." "No," said Miss Marple, "not yet." He turned to her. "You seem determined to keep the matter uncertain." "Truth is often uncertain before it is simple." She picked up her knitting at last. The needles clicked softly, a domestic sound in a room full of suspicion. It changed the air. People looked at her with the faint irritation one feels toward calmness in a storm. "Mr. Edmund," she said, "why did your aunt give you the key to her desk yesterday?" "She wished me to examine estate papers." "Which papers?" He hesitated. "I cannot recall precisely." "That is unfortunate. Did you examine them?" "Briefly." "And yet the letters were missing from the desk by evening and in Mr. Hargreaves's keeping. Did you know that?" "No." "Did you know she meant to send them to the inspector?" "No." "Did you know they concerned inheritance?" His mouth tightened. "I know only what has been said here." Miss Marple nodded as if satisfied, though she was not. She turned to Reverend Selwyn. "You knew Elena Rosewood as a young woman." The Reverend looked pained. "Yes." "And Miss Vale's mother?" "Yes." "You cared for her?" A silence descended, gentler than shock and sadder than fear. Miss Vale looked at him. Reverend Selwyn bowed his head. "I did very much." "Then you knew the old accusation was false?" "I suspected, I did not know." "Elena knew?" "Yes." "And last night she summoned you too, did she not?" The Reverend closed his eyes. Miss Vale whispered, "You were there." "At the garden," he said. "I did not go in. I saw Elspeth leave. Then Elena came to the window and told me it was too late for repentance." His voice broke slightly. She said she had decided at last to do justice. Miss Marple's needles paused. Justice is a word that can terrify the comfortable. Edmund gave a soft laugh. "Are we now accusing the Reverend?" "No," said Miss Marple. "We are listening to him." She turned to Hargreaves. "And you were given the letters because Elena trusted your discretion." He looked down. "She trusted my fear. She knew I would hide them and say nothing." "Why?" His face hardened with shame. "Because I had once provided medicines to Sir Alistair without asking questions. Medicines for the woman he sent away, Elspeth's mother." Miss Vale's face drained of color. Thomas took one step forward, then stopped himself. Hargreaves said, "I was young. I believed what I was told." Miss Marple's voice softened. "We often do when belief is convenient." The room was silent, except for the faint spit of coal in the grate. Then Miss Marple rose. She crossed to the window and looked out at the garden beneath the lavender room. "Inspector, the footprints below the window, did you notice their direction?" "In and out," he said. "Were they?" He frowned. "Someone wished us to think an intruder came from the garden, but the deepest impressions were made facing away from the house. The lighter ones faced toward it." Halden understood slowly. The person carrying weight was leaving. Yes, leaving the room after placing Mrs. Rosewood there. No, the body was not carried through the window. That would be foolish and difficult, but something else was carried out. "The letters?" asked Miss Vale. "No," said Miss Marple. "Those had gone already." She looked at the piano room door across the hall. The ribbon device required someone to enter from outside later and create the illusion of a disturbance. But why draw us to the music room? Thomas said quietly, "To take us away from somewhere else." Miss Marple smiled at him. "Exactly." She walked to the side table where the unopened morning letters still lay. One envelope, damp-edged from snow, remained beneath the silver tray. "Yesterday morning," she said, "Thomas delivered letters. One was opened. One was left where it could be found. One blank page scented with lavender. A summons, yes, but not to a leaner." She turned to Edith, who stood trembling near the door. "My dear, you brought the post in, did you not?" "Yes, miss." "Did Mrs. Rosewood open it?" "No, Mr. Edmund did. He said she had asked him to sort it." Edmund's face changed, not much, but enough. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him, then moved away, as though he were not the most important person in the room. That more than accusation unsettled him. "You see," she said, "the truth is in small habits. Mrs. Rosewood stirred her tea 12 times. She put her spoon on the saucer. She kept keys in their place. She opened her own post. The murderer forgot her habits because he knew her position, not her person." Edmund whispered, "This is ridiculous." But no one agreed. Miss Marple continued, "The person who killed her was not merely frightened by old shame. He was frightened by correction, by a new will, by a family truth that would make his inheritance uncertain. He arranged the room, the cup, the handkerchief, the piano, all as threads leading away from himself." Halden asked, "Then the napkin?" "A thread leading toward himself," Miss Marple said, "placed too boldly. A last-minute attempt to appear framed should suspicion fall on him." Edmund's composure cracked at last. "You have no proof." Miss Marple looked toward the fire. "No," she said softly, "not yet, but we have almost reached the thread he forgot to cut." Outside, the winter sun slipped from behind a cloud, and for one brief moment the whole room filled with cold, revealing light. Chapter 9. The Unveiling in the Drawing Room. By the time evening returned to Rosewood Manor, the snow outside had begun to melt from the branches, falling in soft drops that tapped against the window ledges like cautious fingers. The drawing room was prepared as though for an ordinary gathering. A fire burned in the marble grate. Lamps glowed beneath silk shades. The tea service had been laid upon the low table, polished silver reflecting the amber light in trembling fragments. Yet no one mistook the scene for comfort. The room had become a stage, and every person seated within it knew that before long, someone would be named. Miss Marple sat near the fire, her hands folded peacefully over her knitting bag. Inspector Halden stood by the mantel. Miss Vale occupied the chair nearest the window, with Thomas Rill behind her, grave and protective. Reverend Selwyn sat with his head bowed as though in prayer. Mr. Hargreaves stood stiffly by the bookcase. Mrs. Price and Edith remained together near the door, both pale, both silent. Edmund Rosewood was the last to enter. He had dressed with care. Too much care, Miss Marple thought. His collar was immaculate, his hair brushed smooth, his expression composed into something resembling injured dignity. "Inspector," he said, "I hope this will be brief." "So do I," replied Halden. Miss Marple lifted her eyes to Edmund. "The truth is often quite brief, Mr. Rosewood. It is the lies that take up time." He smiled faintly. "Then I shall be interested to hear which you have chosen." She did not answer at once. Instead, she looked at the tea table. "Mrs. Price, would you be so kind as to pour?" The cook started, "Me, miss." "Yes, my dear, just as you did every morning for Mrs. Rosewood." With trembling hands, Mrs. Price poured a cup of tea. The liquid ran dark and clear into the china. She added 1 lump of sugar. "How many times did Mrs. Rosewood stir?" asked Miss Marple. 12, whispered Mrs. Price. "Please do so." The room watched as the spoon turned slowly in the cup. 1, 2, 3, the silver tapping softly against porcelain. By the 12th turn, the sound had become almost hypnotic. Mrs. Price placed the spoon upon the saucer. Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly. A fixed habit. A small ritual, the sort of thing a servant remembers because the household day is built upon such repetitions." Edmund sighed. "We have discussed the spoon." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but not what it tells us fully." Inspector Halden looked at her with quiet attention. "In the lavender room," she continued, "the spoon lay upon the polished table, not on the saucer. That meant one of 2 things. Either Mrs. Rosewood did not drink the tea herself, or someone arranged the scene without knowing her habits." Edmund said, "Or death interrupted her." "No, the tea had been stirred, the sugar dissolved, the spoon placed deliberately. People interrupted by death do not tidy wrongly." A silence followed, delicate and cold. Miss Marple reached into her bag and withdrew the linen handkerchief marked with the embroidered E. This was found near the manor path, scented faintly with lavender. It seemed to implicate Miss Elspeth Vale or perhaps Alina Rosewood herself, but there was something curious about it. The embroidery was too new. Miss Vale looked up. "My handkerchiefs are plain," she said softly. "I know," said Miss Marple. "I noticed your mending. You are economical. You would not commission so pretty an initial." Thomas looked at Edmund. Edmund laughed quietly. "Surely you are not accusing me of embroidery." "No, of purchasing." Inspector Halden drew a small paper packet from his coat. "We found the bill in your waste paper basket, Mr. Rosewood, from a linen shop in Brackley. 6 handkerchiefs, 1 monogrammed E." Edmund's face did not change immediately. Then slowly color drained from it. "That proves nothing." "Very little proves everything by itself," Miss Marple said, "but small truths keep one another company." She turned to Edith. "My dear, when you brought in the post, Mr. Edmund opened it. He told you Mrs. Rosewood had instructed him to do so." Edith nodded, frightened. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Mrs. Rosewood did not permit others to open her letters, but Mr. Edmund needed to see whether a certain message had arrived. A blank paper scented with lavender, meant to alarm her, to draw her thoughts toward the locked room and toward the past. Reverend Selwyn stirred. Then Alina was being frightened deliberately. Yes, not by Miss Vale, not by Mr. Hargreaves, by someone already in the house. Edmund's mouth tightened. "This is fantasy." "No," said Miss Marple. "Fantasy is usually more original. Your plan was quite ordinary. You wished the old scandal to appear as the motive because the true motive was money." Inspector Halden opened the packet of blue ribbon letters. Mrs. Rosewood had learned that Sir Alistair's hidden child had descendants. The letters could support a challenge to the estate, or at least create enough scandal to delay Edmund's inheritance. Miss Marple looked at Edmund sadly. And she meant to make amends, late imperfectly but sincerely. She told the Reverend as much. She gave the letters to Mr. Hargreaves for safekeeping. She intended to alter her will. "She had no right," Edmund said. The words came quietly. Too quietly. Everyone heard them. Miss Marple's gaze did not leave his face. "Ah, that is always the phrase, is it not? No right. People who take what is not theirs often become very passionate about rights." Edmund stood. "I will not be lectured in my own house." "It is not yours yet," said Inspector Halden. The words struck harder than any accusation. Edmund turned toward the door, but Thomas moved slightly, blocking it without drama. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm as falling snow. "You knew your aunt took medicine in the evening. You knew Mrs. Price prepared her morning tea. You entered her sitting room before Mrs. Price returned, speaking perhaps of estate papers. You added enough of the drug to make her drowsy, then guided her to the lavender room where she believed some final conversation awaited her." Miss Vale whispered. "She went willingly." "At first," said Miss Marple, I think so. The key was in the door, the portrait above the mantel, the old letters in everyone's mind. She may have thought she was facing the past at last. Mr. Hargreaves said hoarsely, and then she died in the chair, quietly, perhaps believing her weakness was merely age. Mrs. Price began to cry softly. Miss Marple turned toward the fire. Afterward, Mr. Edmund arranged the cup, the spoon, the burned scrap, the window. He placed the lavender scent and the handkerchief to suggest Miss Vale. Later, when doubt grew, he arranged the piano trick to suggest a prowler. Finally, he planted the stained napkin among his own laundry. Inspector Haldon frowned, to make himself seem framed. Yes, a clever man's mistake. He imagined suspicion as chess, but murder is more like housekeeping. The wrong spoon tells more truth than a dramatic clue. Edmund's smile returned, thin and strained. Charming, but where is your proof that I handled the drug? Miss Marple looked to Haldon. The inspector took a small object from his pocket and placed it on the table. A silver paper knife. Edmund stared at it. This was from Mrs. Rosewood's desk, Haldon said. Hidden behind the loose panel in your room, traces of the same preparation are on the handle. You used it to lift the powder from its paper wrapping. Edmund's lips parted. No words came. Miss Marple spoke softly. You forgot another habit, Mr. Rosewood. Your aunt kept her paper knife always on the right side of her blotter. When I saw the empty place, I wondered why a murderer would take so harmless a thing. Then I realized it was not harmless. It had touched what killed her. For a long moment, the room held its breath. Then Edmund laughed. It was not loud, it was worse than loud. It was small, wounded, and terribly human. She would have ruined everything, he said. For a dead servant's reputation, for a bastard line, for sentiment. Miss Vale rose slowly, her face white with pain and anger. My mother was not sentiment. Edmund looked at her with contempt, then away. Inspector Haldon stepped forward. Edmund Rosewood, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Alina Rosewood. The words entered the room with solemn finality. No one moved as the inspector took him gently but firmly by the arm. Edmund did not resist. He seemed all at once smaller than his mourning clothes, smaller than his ambition, smaller than the house he had killed to inherit. As he was led away, the fire settled with a soft sigh. Miss Marple looked at the teacup on the table, the spoon resting exactly where it should. Outside, the thaw continued. Drop by drop, the snow slipped from the dark branches, and Rosewood Manor at last began to reveal the ground beneath.